Welcome to episode 13 of An Understanding. This episode will be about Millard Fillmore. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Enjoy. Millard Fillmore. He's in the Senate chamber overseeing Congress, and it's on a Tuesday, July 9th, when a messenger arrives and sends Millard Fillmore a note that tells him to go to the president's house. Millard Fillmore is a little bit confused, but he goes. And he hasn't really gotten word about Zachary Taylor. I mean, in fact, just a couple months before, he saw him fine, really, for the most part, and healthy. He arrives at the president's house, and he's joined by several of the other cabinet members who inform him of the particular situation that they are in. You see, Zachary Taylor's sick. Very sick. Some iced milk and some fruit has led to possibly Zachary Taylor, former General Zachary Taylor, to become quite sick. They believe it is cholera morbus, and basically just really bad stomach virus and problems that are occurring for old Zachary Taylor. And Millard Fillmore, when he hears of this news, immediately understands what that means. He's really worried. He's really cautious. He's really kind of horrified, a little bit shocked that what is happening was about to happen. He stays there for quite some time, really pondering what's going to happen. Quite a long time, actually. And life will never be the same by the end of that day for Millard Fillmore. By the end of July 9th, Zachary Taylor will die, or expire, as a lot of people say. And once hearing the news, Millard Fillmore is overwhelmed. It's unexpected. He did not sleep a lick throughout that night as he pondered his fate, the fate of the country, and the fate, really, of the future of America, and just in every single fathomable way that, he could think of. He's worried. This had only been the second time a vice president would end up having to become the actual acting president. The rules are still a little bit vague here. He's trying to figure out, am I going to be bullied into, yada, yada, yada? Should I just play ball? He's trying to figure out, in fairness, a lot of ways of how he's going to run his presidency, or how he's going to act when he's going to be sworn in the following day. Millard Fillmore is going to try to play ball. He's going to try to be everything that John Tyler wasn't. Millard Fillmore will actually try to be the president that plays ball. And above all else, actually will try, and for the most part, in a lot of ways, succeed in what will be, functionally, the continuation of John Tyler's legacy. The establishment of the vice president becoming the actual acting president, without any necessity of the actual amendment that will occur much later on in the 20th century for the vice president to become the president. Millard Fillmore is the one that establishes this, and he will become the 13th president of the United States of America on July 10th when he is sworn in. Millard Fillmore is this country's 13th president, and one that I'm probably going to struggle with, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I'm recording this entire episode at night. I'm pretty tired, so it might be all over the place. And just be prepared for that, to be honest with you. And ultimately, too, I don't know how I feel about Millard Fillmore. I really don't. You do all this information, and you try and find and compile everything that you possibly can, and you just read and just want to come to I guess you could say a personal interpretation of it without trying to be influenced by biographies or research papers, etc., etc. And just like a lot of these presidents, I still have conflicting feelings for. But ultimately for Millard Fillmore, it's more about not specific policy, or I question a lot of Millard Fillmore just as a president and as an individual, and I guess I'm probably going to bring this up a couple of times, but I look at Millard Fillmore as truly the son of a poor farmer. I'll explain that when I get to it. But I think just with just that general connotation, I think that might make some sense and might bring up a potential idea for what people ultimately will think of Millard Fillmore. He's fascinating though in a lot of other ways. He's a big reason why Buffalo's a thing, to be quite honest with you. So you can thank Buffalo can think of that. He's also the second person to ascend to the actual presidency itself when General Zachary Taylor dies in office, and really basically just fulfills the last 3 years or another large majority of the presidency itself. And Millard Fillmore is also president during a very tumultuous time in this country's history. You could argue that a lot of what ends up occurring a part of his presidency really is a big kickstarter for what will eventually become the Civil War. And then you can also argue the opposite, where he actually probably pushed the Civil War back 10 years, and I think that's going to be open to your own interpretation. And I'll probably go into it specifically when I talk about the Compromise of 1850. He's also one that I think starts a whole bunch of different things: trade with Asian countries, trying to normalize some relations with European unions. And if I'm going to be 100% honest with you, I'll probably argue Millard Fillmore's time as president is one that is really ultimately pretty boring, if I'm being quite honest with you. Like, his general life before and after the presidency, I think, are far more, interesting than anything else. This motherfucker, ended up traveling Europe once he retired to go shake hands with Martin Van Buren and Queen Victoria, and it's just like, all he does during his presidency is just the big thing is Compromise of 1850 and Commodore Matthew Perry. Ultimately, Martin Van Buren, I think, is one that I'm going to try to leave up to your own interpretation. But undoubtedly, when I start going through this, I'm probably going to have I'm probably going to be exhausted and probably, just whatever. This might be like 2 or 3 hours, so I'm going to try and push through as much as I humanly can, and let's see what happens, people. But ultimately, one that I'm probably, the more I do this and the more I really kind of just go through it simply, just straightforward with you guys, I'm probably going to have a much more negative connotation and tone for when I think of, Millard Fillmore. I think he's a good man, and I think he's a good dude, but I think, he's someone that doesn't really pull the trigger on things, and I'll explain why once we start this, once we get to when he becomes a politician. But he's also in a lot of ways just one of the first presidents that's not very principled, and not principled in the sense of I'm going to do this. He's more principled in the sense of he's just not going to take sides, and one that I think really affects this country in such a negative way, where it's his inaction and not choosing to be steadfast in one particular facet or another in a specific issue, I think is ultimately what makes me feel a little bit negative about it. I'm probably gonna have to work through my feelings about it when we really go through this, but I think that's just to get people started. You'll see what I mean. But anyways, let's begin this. Let's start with Millard Fillmore's childhood. Millard Fillmore was born on January 7th, 1800, in a log cabin in Cayuga County, New York. That is, I think, currently in between the area that is known as modern-day Syracuse and Ithaca. His entire family is originally from, I believe, Connecticut and then Vermont. His father being, born and raised in Vermont along with his mother. They were completely dirt poor farmers, to be honest with you. The only other president I think that can equal the level of poverty that Millard Fillmore went through, I think, was Andrew Jackson at this particular point in time, and it wasn't easy goings in the very early life of Millard Fillmore. Like I said before, his father and mother, Nathaniel and Phoebe Fillmore, were originally from Vermont. And the land there in Vermont was very rocky terrain. Soil was just not very conducive for a farmer, especially for one that was very poor. And Nathaniel and Phoebe, unfortunately, they were always going to be tenant farmers, at least for their very early goings of their initial life and upbringing. And they got an opportunity before Millard Fillmore was born to move to New York, under, I guess you could say, the guise of land speculation, with some surveying. Kind of got it for cheap, and decided he was going to uproot him and his pregnant wife to move to New York in order to have a better life, to own their own piece of land. Upon moving his entire family there, the Fillmores, before Millard was born, they had a daughter, was the firstborn. Millard would be the second child and the oldest son. By the time the family moved there, a lot of things started happening, unfortunately, as Millard Fillmore was being born, by the way. The soil there was terrible in New York. I mean, really, really bad. Not a lot of sun either, unfortunately, around that particular point in time, and also an incredibly harsh winter. And then on top of that, the actual land that they acquired didn't actually, it was fraudulent. I'll just put it that way. It was a terrible deed. And the land was given to them or sold to them under wrong suspicion, etc., etc. And it was an unfortunate point in time for Nathaniel Fillmore, who basically had to, I guess you could say, rent land from a nearby farm in the, what's it called? I can't even pronounce it correctly. This is known as the village of Sempronius. It's about 30 miles away from Auburn, just to give you a general idea. His parents are interesting. Trying to find details about his mother and just some information about her is pretty hard. And it tends to be a little difficult for very, I guess you could say, obscure presidents with not very specifically detailed and poor, unfortunately, childhoods. Just from what I can tell, though, Phoebe Fillmore was a very strong, capable woman. She would have 8 kids total. And a little tidbit, Millard is actually, which it's a fascinating nickname that really originates from, I believe, her maiden name in particular. It was this weird practice for New Englanders to name their first kid after their maiden name. It's fascinating. And Nathaniel, though, was a deeply, he was a very strong, loving, and caring father. He actually lived for quite a long time. He would die in 1863, I believe. He would live for quite a long time and really became a very prominent person. He was a very rags to riches kind of man. And he actually, because you have to understand, being a tenant farmer in a New England territory in the Northeast, and just in general, but specifically in that particular area, renting rather than owning was seen as a decline in social status, because most of the people there were very independent-minded individuals, self-respect. It's still the area of the Boston Tea Party, independence. It still kind of has that perspective a little bit in the area. But he would grow up and really be of strong influence on Millard Fillmore, really pushing him and helping him in any way that he possibly could, being someone that really values his schooling whenever he can actually help him to go to school for the most part. Life for Millard Fillmore growing up was a little bit difficult. He truly grew up a farmer's son in every sense of the word. He actually enjoyed the outdoors and farming and planting and all that than actually being at school or a school desk, although in fairness the opportunity really wasn't there from the get-go. He would enjoy trying to play with all the little kids, etc., and be the older brother that his siblings really needed, but it was difficult at times, especially for young Millard Fillmore. His family would always go hungry. Things were difficult. The season's very arduous, and it would take some time before his father really became a man of stature and capability. Because they were very poor, very, very poor for quite a while. But his father would rise through prominence and become a very prominent individual within the community and be relatively successful. And for Millard Fillmore, he kind of gets to see all this, and his father becomes a very strong influence in his life. But from the get-go, it's very clear he's a farmer's son. He learns everything that he can specifically about farming, the rudimentary, physicality of it, I guess you could say, he really enjoys. He actually is a pretty big and strong man, very good looking, at a very young age, and would be a very strong and big man for a majority of his life until he actually ironically became the president. Personality-wise is really interesting, but I'll explain that later. He really enjoyed farming, like truly so. Growing up, he learned everything that he could. If he wasn't playing with his cousins and his family and his siblings, he was always playing and working in the fields itself. He learned everything: the seasons of farming, planting, harvesting. And he always really enjoyed being in the fields and really learning everything he could about agriculture rather than actually, going to school for the most part. Although he did enjoy reading. Millard Fillmore for years was very content with this very, I guess you could say, basic lifestyle. It was very financially lucrative, and the family was starting to gain financial compensation for a lot of the farming that they were doing, and they were becoming very, very, financially capable and settled to support the entire family. Nathaniel was becoming a very proper person and capable person, and, rise through the ranks itself, and Millard was seen as a very, young, strong person, but education-wise, he was always a little bit lacking. He didn't really like school. He enjoyed reading, and there's a fundamental difference, I think, between the two of those things. And for the most part, his schooling was, if he wasn't being taught at home, he was being taught at the local elementary school, which he rarely attended due to the needs and the demands, of the farm and the farming, just demands in general of what his plantation effectively would require. I don't want to say plantation, but just, the farm itself. I don't know how any other ways to say farm. Anyways, at a young age, he showed curiosity and ambition in doing that, and his father saw that in him at a very young age. But he also didn't want his son to be a farmer. He didn't want it's backbreaking work. It's very difficult, and he wanted his son to be a very prominent individual. So Nathaniel Fillmore, thinking, my son needs a trade, and he needs to do something, and not to mention too, it sounds a little bit kind of shitty in a lot of ways, but it's like, if I can have one less mouth to feed, why not? My son will be better off in a lot of ways too. So he actually arranges this apprenticeship with a cloth maker in a nearby town that he talks to Millard Fillmore about taking. And Millard Fillmore doesn't want to take it. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to leave, but he does so just in, the idea of, well, I guess, why not? I guess I could try it, and fuck it, let's just try it out. See where it goes, what's the worst thing that can happen is I could just leave, So from the very get-go of his apprenticeship with this cloth maker in another town, his father actually paid a small sum in order to have this cloth maker take him under as his apprentice for the most part. Room, board, etc., etc. Learn. Anyways, he hates it. I mean, he fucking hates it. To him, this is just basically slavery in every sense of the word. This experience probably has some impact on his belief in the future of slavery and some facet, at the very least, on his political life and upbringing. Anyways, for 4 months, he works there. He works there meticulously. He hates it, every second of it. And it gets so bad that, 'cause remember, he's 14 years old. He ends up deciding, fuck it, I can't do this shit anymore. So he ends up borrowing $30 from, I believe, a friend. I don't know where he actually gets the money specifically. Regardless, he buys his freedom from this apprenticeship, and he walks all the way home to his family's farm. 100 miles away. Walks all the way home. Fascinating. By the time he gets home, his father's like, bruh, come on, son, what the hell, And he's like, Dad, you're not going to do that shit to me again. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it in my particular way. He's like, okay, how about this? We can work on doing something else in particular. You're gonna be working in a trade, but at the very least, we can talk about which trade or which what you want to do specifically. And then he talks with Millard for a little bit, and he's just like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it my way. So he decides he'll stick with the cloth trade market thing. He's known it for a while. It's been 4 months. And he decides, okay, fine. I'll work in a textile mill. How about that? So he sends his son to New Hope, New York, in order to work in a textile mill. So once he's in New Hope, New York, working at this textile mill, he actually, I don't even want to say enjoys it, but in relative comparison, this is by and large a big difference. He actually ends up becoming a very solid individual there. Ends up being the apprentice of the textile mill, does some bookkeeping, is able to really make sure and improve on tending to the actual textile machines itself. And he's actually there for 4 years, and he makes a decent living, and he's able to really, figure out other things in life that he wants to do. And he's come to the conclusion that I'm kind of dumb. I'm not, he's not thinking that, but, as he's growing older over the course of a couple years, and I'm sorry if I'm speeding through this, his upbringing. There's not the most amount of information. A lot of biographies really skip through a lot of his childhood because it's just tedious, youthful stuff, and there's not specific things that tend to influence young Millard Fillmore in the very, very early goings of his childhood. But when he's in this textile area, in this textile mill, things happen. He sees other people around him, these rudimentary people that don't have the greatest level of education, and he's like, I don't want to be like these people. I want to actually do something. So at 17, at first, he decides he's going to join this new private library, and he begins reading for the next year or two, just reading everything that he could. I mean, the first book I believe he buys is a dictionary, if I'm correct, one of his first purchases, which he uses at work. And while at work, tending the machines, he's just like, apple, like little things like that. His elementary is basic. He knows arithmetic, some mathematics and stuff like that. But for the most part, he's basically like an elementary school education. And in comparison, even in those days, he's had an elementary school education. So for him, this is big shit. You know what I'm saying? So while he's doing all the educational stuff and trying to learn and all that, he actually teaches school for a year, I believe, with all that he taught. But even then, he realized, I don't know why I'm teaching school. And the reason why he's teaching school instead of working at the textile mill is that, unfortunately, the Panic of 1819 is going to occur, and I think he really feels the brunt of the economic collapse in a lot of ways. I don't want to say the economic the collapse. It's not the right word. The economic depression that's going to be occurring, because at the very least, it's very clear that hypothetically the mill that he would be working at would be closed by 1819, which for him was actually a bit of a kind of a good moment. He had saved up quite a bit of money and was actually able to attend school. So he gets the opportunity, and he attends the school academy, specifically in New Hope. Ironically, the academy had just opened up. And Millard Fillmore, being about 19 years old, really learns in school, which is kind of funny because he ends up going to school for knowledge and all that to learn, open new doors for him. And the one thing that he gets the most is a future wife. Yes. One of his teacher in the school, his name is Abigail Powers. 2 years older than him, by the way. And she's the daughter of a deceased Baptist minister. And the sister of a local judge, and she's a really well-read, sophisticated, kind of pretty awesome person. And his father, Millard Fillmore, was immediately taken by her. He became her star student, and they fell in love, which is kind of funny. And they really wanted to marry at this very early going in his life for the most part, but financially speaking, he could not support a wife and a family for the most part. So they held off on that for the time being. But he learned a lot. He was very well educated, and this is a very crucial time for Millard Fillmore because as he's in love, he's trying to figure out what the hell he's going to do with the rest of his life. What am I going to do to actually support my family? And, when I think about supporting a family, sometimes I think fate works in mysterious ways. Because a lot of things are happening throughout this entire time, particularly. The economic collapse and depression really hits a lot of people. even his father, unfortunately, Nathaniel Fillmore, difficulties farming. He actually ends up moving the family to a much more financially capable space with cheaper land, I guess, in Montville, New York. There he actually meets this guy, Walter Wood. He's a judge, a Quaker judge, and was a really, I guess you could say, fascinating individual. He was a landlord and an attorney. And Nathaniel Fillmore is basically like, hey, Walter Wood, you want to hook up my eldest son with some stuff, you know what I'm saying? Could help you. I'll be your big supporter, fan, stuff like that. And he's just like, all right, why not, you know? So Millard Fillmore comes home one day, and he's having dinner, and his mother is basically like, hey, so this Judge Wood, he's going to actually teach you some shit, you know? Miller's like, whoa, law, I don't know if I'm ready for that. And then Nathaniel's basically just like, hey, you want to get married and get that Abigail Powers coochie? And then he's basically like, all right. So immediately, let me make it very clear, it didn't go like that, but I kind of get in my own head, and I kind of just start fantasizing about random shit that happens like that in history. But that's how I picture it. Anyways, Nathaniel Fillmore, around 1820, 1821, Millard Fillmore starts working under Walter Wood as his apprentice, as his law clerk, and begins immediately learning the law and begins his legal education. So when Millard Fillmore begins his law studies, he really enjoys it. He loves it. But unfortunately, life is not perfect. It does not work in a seamlessly in a lot of ways. He actually spends maybe a couple months really studying under Wood, who is a bit difficult at times. Both men are very headstrong. Millard Fillmore is a very strong, headstrong person, and he's taking the studies with a grain of salt, and he's really learning a shit ton. He goes hard into the studies. Abigail, his future wife, really pushes him to do it. You know, she loans him some books that she might know and all that stuff, and really becomes his real cheerleader in a lot of ways. And basically both of them are just falling madly in love with each other. That even by 1820, he asks her to marry him, and she says yes, which she's like, oh, I just love you. I don't care if you can't support me. I just love you. I'm gonna support you no matter what. You know, little things like that. The reason why it's difficult is because the mill actually opens back up around this particular point in time, and he's still apprenticed there. So in order to actually pay off and not actually have to work there, it kind of sucks. So he has to work there, and then he teaches school on the side in order to pay off his debt, I guess you could say, to the actual textile mill, in order to be emancipated from the textile mill. Which means also he's going to have to live at home. So he ends up living at home at times, going back and forth, which kind of sucks. If he's not staying at the textile mill, he's back home teaching. You know, it's a very difficult time for Millard Fillmore, and he actually has to take a sabbatical from studying law, which is really difficult. And Walter Wood doesn't really like that, but he understands, you know. But still, it's a difficult choice Millard Fillmore has to make, and it takes quite a long time. Basically almost a year and a half before he's even able to basically be out of the debt of the textile mill itself. So when Millard Fillmore goes back to studying law, he really goes all in to studying law. But unfortunately, he's a little bit, poor. He's really not liquid right now, if that makes any sense. And he needs to make some extra money. He's got a future wife he's going to have to support, little things. You get a little bit desperate. So in order to get some extra money, Millard Fillmore decides he's going to accept a few dollars representing someone in a case before a justice of the peace, And you have to understand, he's not a part of the Bar Association yet. He's not a certified lawyer, and he knows Walter Wood is not going to appreciate it. So he goes to do this, and first off, understand, you don't have to be a part of the bar, be a certified lawyer to represent someone, but it's kind of looked down upon in that particular time of society. It's kind of like, this guy for real. Anyways, Walter Wood finds out about this, and he is mad, very, 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 very mad, and reprimands Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore is really thick-headed at this particular point in time. He's like, I will not be talked down like this, and he says, I'd rather do yada yada and study on my own and do all that stuff and have to be with you. So After a lot more choice words, Millard Fillmore and Walter would end up, I guess you could say, amicably parting ways by 1821. In 1821, Millard Fillmore is a 21-year-old man, engaged, and really trying to figure out what the fuck he's going to do with his life now. So, what does any free, yet now young, emancipated man do? Move with his family. You see, by the time he's about 21, he's emancipated. He's free to do whatever the fuck he wants to do. Doesn't have to really follow his father, whatever, yada, yada, yada. The entire family moves to Buffalo. And yes, if you're from Buffalo, Millard Fillmore is your boy, okay? You know what I'm saying? Anyways, he's free to strike on his own, and he decides he's going to move with his family to Buffalo. And there's a lot of opportunity in Buffalo. I believe Abigail's with me, but they wouldn't be married for a couple more years. And this particular point in time, he's just trying to do whatever he can for the most part, to try and figure out what he wants to do. And he's really decided on law. Like, that's the career to go to, and the direction to really point myself into. So while he's in Buffalo, he again teaches school again, and while at night, he studies law. He goes to a whole bunch of different attorneys. He basically just asks anyone that's going to take him. He's like, hey, can you teach me? He's like, okay, I'll just teach you. And there's a whole bunch of clerks that actually help him. And he actually gains a fascinating reputation. He's hardworking. He's very, how do I put it? Confident, I guess you could say. But also unconfident at the very same end of the spectrum. Very fascinating. Very cautious, very conservative, very studious, hardworking. A whole bunch of different things to really explain Millard Fillmore. He always dressed well. He always spoke well. He's always clearly a very intelligent, strong, good-looking young man. But he's that kind of person that you look at and you're like, why do I feel like you're nervous about something? Why do I feel like you don't have the overwhelming level of confidence that you probably should? And that would always be a very fascinating aspect about Millard Fillmore. So I think we should just talk about his personality a little bit, because I think his personality above all else is one that devotes its own small section of time to. Fillmore, personality-wise, is a very complex and pretty fascinating individual. And I'll just be brief about this, because I can go about 15 minutes on his personality for the most part, and just go into the specific details of why I think he thinks the way he is. The best way I could describe Millard Fillmore is that he's basically the son of a poor farmer, and it's very apparent. He thinks like he's the kind of person that, like, I'm gonna dress meticulously, I'm gonna be well spoken, and be very smart. I'm gonna think in different ways, think in orthodox kind of thing. I'm gonna be hardworking. I'm gonna be studious. I'm gonna be cautious. I'm gonna be serious. And then, at the very same end of the spectrum, it's very clear he doesn't have 100% confidence. Not like a lot of his contemporaries when he was in office, or just in general, for the most part. And I think that's just a testament just to who he is. He's just that kind of person that feels like he has to overcompensate. And ultimately, a lot of the times when he overcompensates, I think it really hurt him in the early going of his law career in a lot of ways. It helped him in a lot of ways, too, because, I think a lot of people saw him as a really friendly, kind of very always there, but also in a lot of ways non-threatening in the ways that, I'm going to lose clients because of this guy, And there's just something off about Millard Fillmore, not as a bad way or bad person, but as someone who, he's the kind of person that would, when you get to know him on a personal level in small group settings, he's great. But when he's the president of the United States and he's got to talk to a shit ton of people, might want to hold off on that, if that makes any sense at all, what I'm trying to say here. Regardless of what happens, and what my opinion on his personality, Millard Fillmore is a highly intelligent and very capable individual. That is undeniable. In fact, when he's studying and learning the bar, he's basically talking to a whole bunch of different people, and they're all kind of just like, "Damn, dude, you kind of know what the fuck you're talking about. You know what is going on." He impressed everybody, all the attorneys that he worked with, and basically within 2 years, despite being behind academically for many years, Millard Fillmore impressed everyone that he actually was allowed to go and admit into secure his admission to a bar very early on, and actually passed it at the age of 23 years old. Deeply fascinating. And now that he's an actual lawyer certified in the state of New York, has a very fascinating opportunity. He's going back and forth. He's talking to his family. His family's like, well, why don't you open up a law firm in Buffalo and stay with the family and stuff? And he's like, well, I want to make it on my own. And not to mention, too, I don't have 100% confidence in my capabilities with all these lawyers in New York that I'm learning from. They're all really good, and I don't want to step on their toes, et cetera, too. So I'm going to go. I'm going to go, and I'm going to move. Me and Abigail are going to go into East Aurora. So he leaves and goes to East Aurora. It's a very small community. And in East Aurora, he's basically there by himself. There's literally no one there. East Aurora is basically just empty. It's a very small community, and while there, his first couple things that he does is basically collecting debts, working on land deeds, etc., and really just doing farmers clerking and stuff, I guess you could say, in farmer cases, like in a lot of ways. He's kind of like a farmer's lawyer, but a much better farmer's lawyer, if that makes any sense, in terms of a lawyer hierarchy. Aside from doing all that land stuff, yada yada, doing deeds, wills, etc., he actually built a very strong practice. Basically, with all his money, became very financially capable and liquid, and really was able to support his wife, or his future wife now at this particular point in time. I think they are together. He purchasing every single law book that he can, and with his money, he actually, social status was very important in that particular time, and for Millard Fillmore, that there was no bigger thing, especially being a poor kid. You want to be a more prominent and capable individual, so like it reaches really apex points for him. He's buying all the good, like all the Gucci name brand products, etc. He switches churches because this church is like much more Gucci than anything else. I don't know another term to say prominent than Gucci that I think is really funny. But for the most part, he getting a carriage for the most part, and he goes and joins Abigail, etc., and he's this tall, handsome lawyer and very successful, and they decide they're going to actually finally tie the knot after basically 6 years of being engaged. Quite a long time. And they were married by an Episcopalian priest in February of 1826. And for him, this is really good because around this particular point in time, he gets an appointment as the commissioner of deeds in that particular area. That's the first step for Millard Fillmore in holding public office. For Millard and Abigail, they would have 2 kids, a boy named Millard, their first boy, and then a girl named Mary 4 years later. Only 2 kids, so it's much more simpler for Millard Fillmore than a lot of the previous presidents who have had a shit ton of kids, or a lot of them die, a lot of them live. Very complicated. Poor Zachary Taylor. Anyways, it was also during this time, after getting married and then having a bunch of babies, that Millard Fillmore was both economically and socially becoming a much more prominent person. The economic aspect of it kind of falling behind a little bit, but he was able to hire a couple clerks, a couple individuals, etc., and really, had this young, brilliant man named Nathaniel K. Hall, who would actually be one of the closest confidants of his entire life, be his law partner, would actually first study under him. This is where politics really gets interesting when, Millard Fillmore is holding public office technically for the first time in his entire life, that things really start to get very fascinating. By all accounts, he's basically this anti-Masonic person, and really someone that would vote more along the lines of the Whigs, Northern interests, obviously, because he's from the North. I believe he voted for John Quincy Adams, but I'm not 100% positive, or at least he supported John Quincy Adams. One incident, though, a very strange incident, actually happened right after he got married. There was this I guess you could say a journalist in a lot of ways, this guy named William Morgan. a disaffected Mason and ready to expose the whole Mason organization and the Mason people, was allegedly kidnapped. Dun, dun, dun. Never seen again. I'm just kidding. He was just a regular dude. Actually, ironically, a stone mason kind of person, who was actually part of the whole Masonic order that was going to reveal the organization's secrets. Politics, am I right? Regardless of whether it was actually true or not, I really don't know. If I know anything about politics, probably true. Who knows? But for the most part, this actually led to a very, I guess you could say, slight advantage for the people who would eventually become the Whigs and supporters of John Quincy Adams, and especially in the state of New York, where New York state politics very, very deeply fascinating. Like I said before, if you've heard of our Martin Van Buren episode about the growing Democratic Republican movement during that particular point in time versus the whole Federalist movement, etc., etc. Martin Van Buren is the catalyst for the Democratic Party in a lot of ways. So, Anyways, Martin Van Buren was really drawn to the anti-Masonic movement. And obviously, just like many of the other notable individuals in that particular era of time, if you were in politics, if you were able to debate, if you were able to do all these things, that was a sign of social status. And for him in particular, just like a lot of these kids who grew up poor to actually gain prominence, that's the key. That's the big ticket right there. Politics. Millard Fillmore at this particular point, roughly around 29, 30 years old, and a really prominent individual in East Aurora. His law practice was really growing, booming in a lot of ways, and he was a highly respectable person in that particular area, very highly respected. And the entire, what was at this particular point in time before they became the Whigs, were the National Republican Party. They were looking for people in order to fill up some seats, especially in the state legislature within New York. And very, very quickly, Millard Fillmore was really one of the guys to do so, and especially opposition to the entire whole newly created Democratic Party around this particular point in time. And his support for John Quincy Adams for another term. He was selected as a delegate several times to first anti-Masonic conventions, where he actually started negotiating a whole bunch of different things within the actual party itself, and showed that he actually had a lot of political prowess for the most part. And he really kind of weaved his way into, I guess you could say, into the state assembly itself. He actually was so prominent as an individual. Everyone really just liked Millard Fillmore. And he actually ended up getting the nomination and getting the first of several terms in the state assembly. He was elected in November of 1828. Millard Fillmore serves under the New York State Assembly. He serves 3 consecutive one-year terms. And during this particular point in time, he's just combating Democrats, and specifically New York State Democrats, because you have to understand this is a very tumultuous time. Democrats are ruling, and they're kind of taking over New York. Martin Van Buren especially is really he's effectively the leader, the creator of the Democratic Party in a lot of ways, at least the ideological, intellectual sense of it. And it's really fascinating. He doesn't really have a specific party. He's, like I said, he's a part of this National Republican coalition, I guess you could say. He's eventually going to be a Whig, the last Whig president, by the way. His time here is really interesting. A lot of the times, and this is probably the one period of his career where I'm pleasantly surprised by and pleasantly happy with, where he actually went across party lines and really didn't care about specific personal achievement and political achievement in a lot of ways. Obviously in some ways, because, you want some, like, I won and I'm this great person. But, there were some things he actually, things that actually specifically affected him in a lot of ways, notably, imprisonment, and debtor's imprisonment, I might want to point out, and debtor's bankruptcy. Basically, because back then, you could actually go to jail, unfortunately, for being in debt, which he argued was, to this day, actually kind of ironic in a lot of ways, where it's like, if you don't pay your your debt to society, etc., you go to jail. So it's like, okay, if I have a tax, for instance, and I go to jail, that, that's paid for by taxes, and it's a full circle, basically. And it's kind of funny because they actually, I believe, New York State, and specifically in Albany, where he was from, he's shrewdly sponsoring this specific bill. It was a problem because it's sponsored by the anti-Mason legislation and coalition part of the National Republican Party, and the New York State Democrats really just were opposing it because it's anything that's not a Democrat. So effectively, he gave up authorization of the bill. Like, he literally was the guy who was the sponsor of it. He's like, "Hey, you guys can do it as long as it gets done." And effectively, they basically just unleashed it upon New York itself, as the Democrats were basically saying, "Okay, we'll take it," and then everyone's lying them as this great, reformer, etc., etc. And a lot of people were taking notice of Millard Fillmore for being a bit of a shrewd politician, because in a lot of ways, he's getting the things that he wants to do. And I think that's what Millard Fillmore is going to be very, very good about when he becomes a United States House of Representative member. Before we get to that, though, these laws actually low-key really helped him and a lot of people in New York, because, hey, if you can't go to prison for being in debt, it's going to make things a little bit easier. People are going to have to deal with a lot more shit, unfortunately, in New York, for instance, in the state, and just in the economic, trying to grow a business kind of scene, in a lot of instances, in a lot of ways. But for the most part, the economy really boomed because of legislation like this, and specifically people just like Millard Fillmore with a growing law practice, for instance. And his practice is really growing. It's growing exponentially. He's becoming a bit of a household name within New York as well, especially for being such a prominent opposition to the Democratic Party in general. And a lot of his business is really blowing it up, in Buffalo, New York. And this is at a particular point in time, Millard Fillmore, in around 1830, says, "You know what? All right, why not?" So he does the one thing that not a lot of people in this country would do, and no disrespect to Buffalo, but he moves to Buffalo. So other than moving to Buffalo, he tries to do a couple more things within the New York State Assembly, reforming a lot of things, bankruptcy laws, obviously, prison reform in a lot of ways. Really, a lot of things have to do with debt. I wonder why. Anyways, most of his time is really just going to be combating Democrats in a lot of these instances specifically. And for his efforts, he decides, I'm doing pretty good. I'm doing pretty Gucci. Buffalo, I think I'm good. So, other than doing the whole state assembly thing for a little bit longer, in 1831, he effectively leaves the role. And once he leaves the role, he does a whole bunch of things. He's enjoying being a father now in Buffalo, New York. I'm sorry, I don't want to laugh at Buffalo. If anyone, for some reason, is listening to this and you're from Buffalo, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to make fun of you guys, but it's funny. Let's just be honest. Anyways, he does everything that a prominent man should. He starts talking into debate clubs. He goes and joins this Unitarian church. He's on a whole bunch of corporate boards and a whole bunch of different businesses. And in Buffalo, he's this really awesome man, a well-off, prominent Protestant young man who has this New England background, and this man of virtue, moral, and faith. A whole bunch of different things like that. And in Buffalo, his future looks very, very promising. People start really, really liking him. And Buffalo actually starts becoming a very prominent city too, by close to, 1860, or first originally went from the time when Millard Fillmore is originally living in Buffalo. It's probably about close to maybe 10,000 people. And then by the time 1860 rolls around, unfortunately, on the precipice of the Civil War, the population explodes close to 100,000, 10 times that in 30 years. And, Buffalo's growing big. And guess who's getting bigger? Millard Fillmore. People really like him. And things start going his way when there's an opportunity for him to win a seat within the House of Representatives. So he really decides there's an open seat. He's really contemplating it because he's really enjoying his life. And he knows at this particular point in time, if he goes into politics, there's this young man, well, not young at this particular point in time, young man named Andrew Jackson, who just so happens to be president, that he's going to really have to go against. And he's going to have to go against and join a particular party. So he really thinks about this because, his party affiliation, in a lot of ways, is really uncertain, okay? Because when he first went in, he was in this National Republican. But I don't know if he was ever going to be truly a Whig, or, a Democrat by any means. He wasn't going to be a Democrat, but he worked with them. But it doesn't matter, Specifically, the National Republican Party was dying, and they needed people in this new coalition that was anti-Jackson and very, very pro-Whig. So, once Millard Fillmore applies and successfully in New York wins his seat in the House of Representatives in 1832, he becomes a member of the Whig Party officially. Very briefly, before we go into Millard Fillmore and his entire career as a member of the House of Representatives and Congress, I think it's important to talk about the Whigs. And I think it's really, and I've touched on them several times. Obviously, we've had 3 Whig presidents, but I think it's really interesting to talk about a specific Whig president that was really a part of the Whig Party, effectively from the get-go. Tyler wasn't a part of it from the get-go, and he was more of a, technically he kind of was from the get-go in a lot of ways, but he was always a Democrat at heart, for the most part. He's the only one that sided with the South in the Confederacy, and, the other 2 were very ambiguous, Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, politically speaking, and probably never really thought about politics in a very broad sense of the word, but Fillmore was in it from the very get-go. And I think what would ultimately be the undoing, 100%, I believe, with the Whigs is inter-party turmoil. Say what you will about the Democrats, but a big reason why they ended up winning so many fucking times was because they had party unity, for better or worse. And that's always something that I always found interesting, because the Whigs, they had a coalition, they had a strong party. At the very least, in a lot of ways, they're kind of like today's modern Democrats, where it's just like, if you just don't like the Republican Party, for instance, you just say, fuck it, I'm just going to vote Democrat, whatever, I don't care, And in a lot of ways, that's kind of how they were back then. They had enough people on their side for the most part, and the Democrats were always up and down. A lot of good things and a lot of bad things for the Democrats, and the ultimate problem with the Whigs is, like I said just recently, just like 15 seconds ago, was inter-party turmoil. And what I mean is that this party is really controlled by 3 groups, I would say. It's basically either Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and everyone else. That's just the truth. You had the people who supported Henry Clay, you had the people who supported Daniel Webster, and then you had the people who supported anyone but these 2 motherfuckers, for the most part. And it's always going back and forth, politics on just who gets to do what. Daniel Webster was the Secretary of State for John Tyler for the better part of 2 to 3 years. He just decided to stay on just to spite Henry Clay. It's little things like that go a long way with sowing party disunity in a lot of ways. And Millard Fillmore falls into this category, in this camp too, as a member, specifically, I would say, of the Daniel Webster wing of the Whig Party. Daniel Webster he helps bring him in. He actually helps them get this honor of being a part of the Supreme Court Bar Association, for the most part, which really doesn't really do a lot of things, but to get it from Daniel Webster in particular, and that's just, you might as well just, it's like, say what you will about Obama, but it'd be like, if you just got like, a fist bump from Obama, that'd be like, oh, okay, that's kind of cool, it's interesting, say what it is and what you will about it, because he's black, just kidding, that's a terrible joke. But anyways, point fundamentally being that, he was basically knighted in a lot of ways by Daniel Webster, and he was always going to be indebted to Daniel Webster in a lot of ways, because from that point on, Millard Fillmore's career as a lawyer was going to be set, whether or not he stayed in political office or not. But from that point on, when he joins politics and he wins that seat and officially becomes a Whig because of Daniel Webster, his fate is sealed in a lot of ways. So you're probably asking how he even got into Congress, to be honest with you, because despite being a prominent individual, I kind of just briefly glossed over that. Well, it's a little bit complicated. You see, there's this New York mob boss named Thurlow Weed. He was a newspaper publisher. He had been this anti-Masonic leader and really liked Millard Fillmore and thought he was, this rising star, and just wanted to really push him towards joining the Whigs, and really took over the New York organization of the Whig Party within the state of New York itself. Weed was one that is a deeply fascinating individual and should probably do more information on. But for the most part, Fillmore's rise to fame in a lot of ways was because of Thurlow Weed, who basically by 1834 was just such a prominent individual that he's basically just controlling New York State politics until, like the likes of Tammany Hall, et cetera, yada, yada. You know how it goes with politics. Anyways, once he actually does get in, he's basically one of the chief oppositions against Andrew Jackson in a lot of ways. And this is a very fascinating time. Millard Fillmore does a whole bunch of different things. He's trying to get to a couple different committees. He's trying to keep his business afloat. He joins the New York militia. He's a major, I believe, at one point. And he's also missing his family. He leaves his wife in Buffalo with her at this particular point in time, baby daughter. And he struggles, for trying to basically stay in Washington. And while in Washington, he's doing a whole bunch of different things. He's trying to urge expansion of a whole bunch of different things, specifically within the city of Buffalo itself, I would probably say. One of these things was trying to expand the Buffalo Harbor, and basically just a whole bunch of different expansions with the Erie Canal, specifically in New York State as well. And for the most part, a lot of people really didn't like the fact that he was pushing a lot of these things that seemed like states' issues, for the most part, and trying to get the federal government involved with it. And for the most part, this is kind of true. So while initially pushing a lot of these things, he kind of gives up on a lot of these issues and actually resigns at one point, very early on in his career, mainly due to the fact that his re-election campaign was not going to go well. Let's just be honest, states' rights, yada, yada, yada. It does not matter who you are politically when you're pushing these things aggressively the way that he was. It was not Gucci, as they would say. So he was just not likely to win the re-election campaign. In a lot of ways, he actually dissolves a lot of the Whigs and anti-Masonic alliances so he can actually posit himself better in the future. I think that's really interesting. So what does Millard Fillmore do between 1834 to 1836, the time that he's outside of political office? Well, he does a whole bunch of different things. First and foremost, he actually tries to run for governor, specifically the Whig governor candidacy, fails, loses to William H. Seward, which really sucks, unfortunately. But he uses his time to really get his ducks in a row, really consolidate his power in a lot of ways, and really builds up the relationship with the Tweed dude, also Daniel Webster, and really kind of coalescing the anti-Mason party to join the Whig party in a lot of ways, really helping that with Thurlow Weed himself, who was this anti-Masonic person who really pushed forward the idea of Whigs and anti-Masonic people really helping each other for the most part. Regardless, though, a lot of things were working for Millard Fillmore's candidacy in a lot of ways. Anti-Jackson unity had really been rising through the years, and despite losing New York State in the election of 1836 with Martin Van Buren specifically, it was as close of a race as one could possibly get. And during this particular point in time, Millard Fillmore, with a real opportunity, decides, I'll run one more time and join the House of Representatives again. Runs in 1836, and Millard Fillmore is brought back into the House of Representatives for the state of New York as a Whig. Gosh darn it. Millard Fillmore would be a part of the House of Representatives for several years. Have a very fascinating career. He'd be the runner-up for the Speaker of the House. He'd be a member and specifically the chairman of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, one that a previous president, James K. Polk, was also chairman of. And a lot of the time during his time specifically as the House Ways and Means Committee, and for the most part, a lot of his politics, for the most part, as a Whig, remember, in the House of Representatives, was really about economic programs and economic philosophy for the most part. And a lot of that was really pure Whig. I mean, it's always been pure Whig. He actually was a part of trying to get the Second National Bank rechartered and was on, obviously, the Whig side against the anti-Jackson, or against the Jackson, anti-fucking bank war scenario and whatnot. But for Fillmore, it was very, very Whig policy. Mainly, first and foremost, the Whigs trying to keep him at their specific rate, in a lot of ways to prevent at least in their perspective, prevent the national government from going into a severe, deeper financial crisis, which was roughly around 35 to 45% tax rate, I guess you could say, for the most part. It was obviously a protectionist tariff. That makes sense to keep things in America for the most part. And he really fought hard on it. The biggest problem is that when you look at the finer details, some of the biographies that are detailed, tariffs are not good at times when they're overwhelmingly protective, if that makes any sense, because it depends on the market in a lot of ways. For instance, the actual tariff for iron, for instance, increased to close to 80%. That's insane, and it really help benefit Fillmore financially, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. He was an investment kind of individual, and a lot of his constituents, specifically in Buffalo, who at this particular point had a rising population, so it was really good for northern businesses for the most part. But a lot of people specifically saw this as, specifically Democrats, as, boo, that's not very good at all. What are you doing, Millard Fillmore? Then Whigs are kind of just like, man, this guy is the rising star of the party. Politics, am I right? That's just how a lot of people saw it. Anyways, that's just one specific critical aspect of his time during Congress. So I would probably say three things, really, for the initial time of his original House of Representative membership from 1836 to roughly 1842. It covers three things that really span, for the most part, the entire time of his career, for the most part. First and foremost is kind of the obvious, is his rise to prominence as a member of the Whig Party itself. I mean, by the time he leaves, in a lot of ways, because he's almost close to being the Speaker of the House himself, he's up there with the likes of Clay, Daniel Webster, goes from really kind of just a prominent rising star to actually being a star. It's very fascinating, and I don't want to talk ill of the Whigs or anything like that, but let's just be honest. If one of your rising stars and one of your actual prominent individuals is a guy named Millard Fillmore, who is Millard Fillmore, and he's basically one of your top 5 dogs, that's probably not the best thing to have for the most part in terms of your party's success, unfortunately. Number 2 is in a lot of ways the conflicts and the rivalries within New York State politics in particular. Weed himself and Seward were kind of aligned together ideologically and politically in a lot of ways, which really made things a little bit difficult for Millard Fillmore personally. He was a little bit personally hurt by it, but also, what are you doing, Weed and Seward? Because Seward had won the governorship, I believe, and from 1839 to 1843, and really ran in relative comparison to Millard Fillmore in a lot of ways, and specifically in some political aspects, notably slavery, which is very fascinating for Millard Fillmore. Fillmore and slavery is really fascinating. It's really interesting, and in a lot of ways, if you're going to figure out how he was going to legislate in terms of his ideas on slavery, you could have just looked at his entire House of Representatives career in a lot of ways. He was never a slave owner. Let me make that very clear. And he detested slavery. That was very adamant. But at the same time, he wasn't going to stop slavery from happening. He's one of these individuals that thinks it's going to just go away through time, et cetera, that people are going to grow out of it eventually. And in a lot of particular cases, because you have to understand, with Millard Fillmore, which I think is really fascinating, a lot of people compare him to Abraham Lincoln. And the truth is that Abraham Lincoln and Millard Fillmore have a lot of similarities to their entire lives. Poor, broke. That means the same thing. Born in log cabins to very fascinating family lives. And ultimately, really were just men who grew up from nothing and became something of themselves. The main difference was Abraham Lincoln, when it came to slavery, when it came to fears of secession from the South, Abraham Lincoln stood firm. He made the right choice at the cost of a lot of lives, but ultimately the right choice, fundamentally. And Millard Fillmore, which I think really was much more tuned to his personality, at least in comparison to Lincoln, because say what you will about Lincoln, but, he was always going to be stern in his ways. He was always going to be, he wasn't the someone that was basically, the poor son of a poor farmer. Millard Fillmore was that, and Abraham Lincoln wasn't. So I just want to make that point very, very fundamentally clear. Now, I tend to think that actually both of them had similar viewpoints on slavery, unfortunately. The main difference is that I think, again, the main difference with Millard Fillmore and Abraham Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln learned. He adapted to it, and he understood that if he was going to do this was going to be a very, big thing that was going to change this country. And Millard Fillmore, he's probably, in my personal opinion, the only president that would not have successfully led this country through the Civil War. And it sounds terrible in a lot of ways, but that's just my own personal perspective, to be honest with you. But, I look at every single president, pre-Civil War president, and at the very least I can make some semblance of a case, at least the ones that lived, for the most part. I mean, Tyler probably would have just joined the South, but that's just a terrible joke. But regardless, Millard Fillmore's ideas on slavery are deeply fascinating, and I think they should be understood in a lot of ways, because I would probably say that's what a lot of Northerners probably felt back then, for better or worse, on the issues of slavery. Because you have to understand, especially around 1840s, the abolitionist movement is growing, but still a minority movement, and especially in the North, specifically. By the time 1840 comes around, though, for Millard Fillmore, he's kind of seen as a bit of a presidential candidate. He's kind of getting some buzz, it's kind of fascinating. Election of 1840 is happening. William Henry Harrison's kind of got the ticket, though. So he's kind of seen as the vice president, but they didn't want two Northern candidates, so they went with John Tyler as the compromise candidate. And then we all know what happens. John Tyler becomes the first vice president to become president, which parallels are going to be very, very fascinating in presidencies, which we tend to see. History has a tendency to repeat itself in very, very interesting and fascinating ways in this country's history. Anyways, when Tyler is president, and it's very clear he's not going to be doing the things that, the Whigs want, Millard Fillmore was fascinatingly he was part of the Whigs, but he really wasn't part of the Whigs. He was also just really trying to do his own thing, because he's still a part of, and specifically the chairman of the Way, Means, and Committee, for the most part. And the big thing that he was trying to do was raise the tariffs, specifically, like I said before, and the tariffs of 1842 would be his big crowning achievement. Unfortunately, at the cost of John Tyler. Because at that point, John Tyler basically lost every single ally he had, both Democrat and Whig, at that particular point in time. So again, very fascinating that a future vice president is going to fuck over another technically vice president and John Tyler. God, it's little things like that I think are fascinating in history. In a lot of ways, Millard Fillmore sealed the fate of John Tyler. Anyways, just like before, unfortunately for Millard Fillmore, age starting to really creep in on the now 40-year-old plus man, for the most part, in Millard Fillmore. Things started really changing. New York really started changing, and he, in particular, really started changing, And I think a lot of ways politics was really toxic for a lot of people. And for him, especially with this whole slavery issue, he really didn't want to have to deal with it, and especially with William Seward in particular, who had committed himself to the abolitionist movement and the slavery movement. What ended up happening specifically that really pushed him for him, for the most part, to be this abolitionist anti-slavery person was the conflict between New York and Virginia, when three black New York merchants were indicated specifically in Virginia for helping a slave escape on their ship. And basically, New York was like, we don't recognize human beings as property, etc. in New York. In Virginia and New York were having this conflict, and a whole bunch of people were really pissed off. And ultimately, New York was like, states' rights, bro, which I gotta give it to New York for that one. Give them up, you know what I'm saying? But anyways, ultimately, that basically pushed them into specific corners, ideologically speaking. In a lot of ways, that kind of separated the Whig Party. You had the Whig Party that was kind of low-key pro-slavery, kind of like a little bit like the Henry Clay. Then you had the Seward Party. And they had people in the middle that probably didn't have slaves, but ultimately really were conventionally just Northerners who didn't want to politicize the issue and didn't really see any sympathy for the slaves. Guys like Millard Fillmore. So in a lot of ways, Millard Fillmore really, first off, he just dislikes Seward on a whole bunch of issues, and especially Seward on issues on immigrants and Catholics in particular, enforcing a whole bunch of different things for New York, and specifically because I think at that point New York State required that all children attend schools, and specifically state support for parochial schools for the most part, and specifically any religious school in general. And Fillmore's like, bro, come on, you can't be forcing that on people. And I think it's a lot of things that were all compounding on Millard Fillmore, because there's a whole bunch of legislation that he ends up going through during this particular time in New York State politics in particular, and some federal politics too. Although most of it at this particular point was just battling with ideological fights for the most part, big and small, and he kind of just got sick of it. So after, in 1842, he just says, I'm not going to run. Well, then they say, well, you're still going to put you in the nomination. And he's like, I'm not going to accept the nomination. Well, we're still going to make you accept it, and then we're still going to run. Well, I'm not going to do the job. So the whole point fundamentally being that they keep trying to get Millard Fillmore back in to the game because he's basically one of their top 10 dogs, and he's just not doing it. He's tired. He wants to go home. Millard Fillmore retires from Congress for a very brief time in 1842. Hold up, I totally forgot. Before he left, he was actually one of the big key individuals, specifically, that allowed Samuel F.B. Morse, obviously the guy who created the telegraph, the inventor of the telegraph, to really test his invention out. He was integral because he was trying to push this bill between both houses of Congress to appropriate about $30,000 to lay underground wire from D.C. to Baltimore to actually test out the invention. A lot of people were really apprehensive at this particular point in time, including Millard Fillmore himself. He wasn't impressed, but then when Morse is like, hey bro, check this out, he's like, whoa, that's pretty lit. And then he just decided, okay, I'll fucking push this shit through. And he's a big reason why, I guess in a lot of ways, the telegraph was a big key invention within this country's history, and would be one of the big key inventions that would literally change this country and advance us in a way that we couldn't even imagine advancing. Anyways, he returns home in April of 1843, and he initially is just chilling. He's relaxing. He's basically thinking to himself, I'm going to enjoy myself. I'm going to make Buffalo a thing, and I'm going to try and make it happen as much as I possibly can. He does a whole bunch of different things around this particular point in time. He's founding Buffalo, the University of Buffalo, or what would now be considered the University of Buffalo. He would eventually be one of the chancellors there, and I think he would be the chancellor there until he died later in the 1870s. And, he's trying to make Buffalo a thing. Buffalo's a really thriving city at this particular point in time. He's just enjoying himself. He's going to lavish parties left and right. He is a national figure, like I said. He's one of the top 5 dogs of the Whig Party, like legitimately and genuinely, for better or worse. The only people that would basically have any say for who he is and what he's going to do in life is going to be 2 people. That's going to be that Thurlow Weed person, who he still hates, but he still controls New York State politics in a lot of ways, and probably Henry Clay. And at this particular point, Henry Clay's got no juice left. He's getting old himself, so it's not very good and looking good for Henry Clay. But that being said, Millard Fillmore, he's getting a little bit older. The handsome good looks are starting to turn him a little bit gray. getting older sucks, the little things like that. A lot of people say it's really affecting him in a lot of ways, and for him, he's really starting to push for more of a national identity than a state identity in New York and Buffalo. So while he enjoys retirement, he's also thinking about the national scene and national politics. And he's thinking to himself, I wonder if I could actually be maybe a vice president or a presidential candidate. Maybe someone will throw my name in the national federal wing, etc., etc. That's what he really wants right now. But unfortunately, things don't go around that way. He actually gets snubbed for the election of 1844, I believe, the Whig presidential election. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons for it, but the biggest by far is the reality that Thurlow Weed and several other people are basically saying, run for governor of New York. And although he's incredibly apprehensive at it, doesn't want to do the job, they basically throw his name in the ring, and he's just like, well, fuck, I don't want to lose, so even though I don't want to do it, screw it. I'll do it for the Whigs, and I'll do it for me to not have an L on my record. So he runs for governor in the election of 1844, I believe. So he runs for governor. His opponent's this guy named, Silas Wright. And it does not go well. He will lose this gubernatorial race in 1844, along with a whole bunch of different Whigs, unfortunately. And it sucks because there's a whole bunch of different reasons. First and foremost, the Whigs just are not popular. Tyler's presidency was a failure. People don't like Henry Clay, and people just did not vote for Whigs. And New York state politics and New York politics in general, it was very heavily contested. New York would be one of the many states that would really define the election. And for Millard Fillmore, it would basically be a losing race, unfortunately for him. He wasn't supported by that Thurlow Weed guy. He basically rubbed him the wrong way. They were on fighting terms, and Thurlow Weed really held control of New York state politics still. And I think above all else, it was just Millard Fillmore's view on slavery, and again, the big issue of that time, Texas annexation. So he was not for annexation whatsoever, and specifically had very conflicting views on slavery. He felt that it was a bit of a states' rights person, and I'm not going to try and guess what he would have done, but he probably would have been for, the Kansas Acts and stuff like that, where Kansas is voting for statehood and felt like, should be upon the state whether or not they're going to have slaves or slavery or whatnot, Even though he opposes slavery, it is what it is. And a lot of people, he was basically just trying to be in the middle as much as possible. Above all else, I will say this about Millard Fillmore: he is a fundamental unionist at heart. Him and Buchanan in a lot of ways, which I think is really interesting. But he would lose his election in 1844, and really for the next 4 years doesn't really do much. He just works. He does his whole lawyer stuff. He goes to a bunch of lavish parties and stuff. Tells stories about he and his father doing all this wheat picking and corn picking, all that stuff, and really enjoying life. He's making a shit ton of money. He's probably making close to 12, 13 grand around that time. That today, that's probably, God, I don't know, what would the inflation rate be like? Like you times that by 25 or 30, and that's probably his modern income. I can't think of anything specifically. My brain does not work like that. But he's enjoying himself. He's founding Buffalo, University of Buffalo, and he's really just trying to do two things. I think he's trying to keep himself in the national spotlight, doing a whole bunch of different things in New York. He still runs a lot of New York state politics as Thurlow Weed's kind of going away for a little bit, and he's really just trying to find a particular role for him that's going to allow him to get back into politics in a positive way and have some relative control. You get bored apparently when you're not in Congress and the whole political game itself. So for the time being, he has an opportunity. He actually gets the opportunity after several years. Time passes. Whigs start regaining a whole bunch of different seats and whatnot within Congress after the midterm elections, and in 1847 he gets the opportunity to be New York State comptroller. For him, you have to understand this is a very key political position. If you know what a comptroller is, he's basically overseeing every aspect of the state's affairs. Supervising banks, canals, financial departments, and, he would easily win this particular election. And although it's a big financial downgrade, for him, this is everything that he's wanting, And he starts his job after New Year's Day, January 1st, 1848. He is the New York State's comptroller, and things will become very interesting for Millard Fillmore. As New York State comptroller, Millard Fillmore really doesn't do a lot. He's only in the actual duty itself for like 6 months. For him, an election is coming up, the election of 1848, and he really doesn't do much there. He tries to regulate the Erie Canal, who goes through, etc., etc. Just trying to root out corruption, trying to fix some business dealings, etc., etc. in New York. And for him, basically the election coming up, he sees what's happening and is like, they're nominating Zachary Taylor. Henry Clay is out, basically because he's old and he's from the South, and he's like, we want to actually win this election, said the Whigs, basically. And the Whigs go to Millard Fillmore, and they're basically like, hey man, you're Northerner, you're probably our best Northern candidate, can you actually become the vice president? And he's like, sure fam, I'll just fuck it, whatever. Sorry. Anyways, Millard Fillmore is basically asked to be the vice presidential candidate for Zachary Taylor, and he accepts because, it's a really good opportunity. And who knows, maybe Zachary Taylor might just die. Whatever happens, And for him, it's a really good opportunity. He's really been out of national politics for quite a long time, and this is his ticket back in. And for Millard Fillmore, it's a really good opportunity, unlike the previous election, where he actually has a fighting chance in a lot of ways, because the Whigs weren't this downhill. They were the underdogs in this election in a lot of ways, and there was a real opportunity, especially with what was happening within the Democratic Party itself, for them to actually win this election. The election of 1848 is between Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore and Lewis Cass and William Butler of the Democratic Party. And understand, I probably explained this already, but I'll just do it briefly. The election of 1848 was really just, Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats really duking it out with each other. A whole bunch of party infighting to a point where the Northern Democrats create this whole new Free Soil Party, nominate Martin Van Buren, and basically say, fuck you guys. And take away a lot of Northern votes and go into the actual Free Soil Party, or a lot of them just say they're just going to vote Whigs for the most part. And effectively, Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore effectively become the next president and vice president, respectively, because of this, after the election of 1848. Before we get into the actual vice presidency, I should probably explain his relationship with Zachary Taylor. It's fascinating. It's probably not the best relationship whatsoever. First and foremost, the men actually never really got to know each other. I believe they only met a week before he was actually sworn in to be president. And, Zachary Taylor, other than a couple times dining in and some meetings, never really talked to Millard Fillmore, never really asked for his guidance. Actually, ironically, went to Millard Fillmore's personal opponent, the whole William Seward guy, who was the governor of New York, and who was under control of Thomas Weed, or Thurlow Weed, and I guess in a lot of ways, rubbed Millard Fillmore the wrong way, obviously, when you're basically going against your ideological and personal foe in New York State politics. Anyways, during his time as the vice president, Millard Fillmore basically just put it around Washington, does his vice presidency thing, oversees the Senate, little things like that, and he really doesn't do a lot. The only thing he really does is just oversee some Senate debates, and it's really, I will make it a point though, it's very noted, he's very silent during a lot of these debates that are occurring. And if you're wondering what's occurring right now, the previous stuff that I was explaining before with Zachary Taylor during his term as president, which would eventually lead to the Compromise of 1850. It's basically the sovereignty of a lot of the new territories gained from the Mexican-American War, the southwestern states, the Oregon Territory, and in a lot of ways too, in the Oregon Territory, and of course, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, all those places, and above all else, California. And it's becoming a really big issue. He's just basically just chilling, vibing, you know what I'm saying? He's smoking a doobie, chilling. He also does see what's happening in New York State politics, specifically Seward and Thurlow Weed really kind of taking over, aggressively so. Because you see in New York politics, especially him getting comptroller, it was a big move, because that way he could basically just oversee everything, keep Thurlow Weed and Seward in check, for the most part, so they don't get too corrupt, etc., etc. The problem is he's not there anymore, and Zachary Taylor's really not stopping Seward or Thurlow Weed in any meaningful way. And unfortunately, this basically allowed an opening for Weed and Seward to kind of take advantage of their patronage system, etc., etc. Basically, for the most part, Seward and Weed were kind of just getting rid of Millard Fillmore's allies within the actual Whig Party, and taking them out and putting people in their particular position, their side of the Whig Party itself, to help give them more of an advantage in terms of just allies within the actual New York State politics and political game itself. And then Millard Fillmore basically during this entire time is like, bruh, why are you doing this, Seward? And he's just like, I want to take over New York. I want to be a presidential candidate someday. And for the most part, it kind of fails, and it kind of works in a lot of ways. It depends. Millard Fillmore tries to go back and forth because he creates a newspaper to counter the Seward newspaper. He even goes to Taylor, and Taylor's like, I will try my best. But then Taylor's just like, whatever, I'm just going to do my own thing and be Zachary Taylor, And Millard Fillmore during this period of time is just, it's frustrating, to put it lightly, for Millard Fillmore. He's losing a lot of allies within the Whig Party, and specifically in New York State politics. But things will be turning in his favor, unfortunately for Zachary Taylor, very, very soon. The Compromise of 1850 was a really tumultuous time during this country's history, and it would really be resolved during Millard Fillmore's time, so I'll get to that in just a second. But, it's rising, and Henry Clay's attempting to put his Compromise of 1850 on the floor. He's negotiating the deal right now, specifically, and Millard Fillmore's actually probably going to vote for it, because he doesn't want segregation in any way, shape, or form within the Union itself. He actually even tells Taylor this, like, several weeks before Taylor dies. He's probably going to vote for the Compromise. He doesn't want anything to happen, and he's basically like, look, man, I know you're not really for the Compromise specifically, but I'm just going to let you know, this isn't because I don't like you, okay? And Taylor's like, well, that's fine, fam, I understand, do what you got to do. And then a couple weeks later, on July 9th, Zachary Taylor dies. And as I had explained much earlier before, Millard Fillmore's kind of just like, bro, what the fuck, And everyone's kind of just like, what? He died? Another fucking Whig president died in office? Parallels are just fascinating with the presidency. Anyways, Zachary Taylor dies on July 9th, and Millard Fillmore is informed that he is going to be the next president of the United States. At noon on July 10th, 1850, Millard Fillmore takes the oath of office and then becomes the President of the United States of America. So before we talk about his presidency, before we talk about everything, the country as a whole, the direction we're going in, let's talk about his cabinet and some of his judicial appointments. He does not keep Zachary Taylor's cabinet. He basically just says you have a month, and they say you have a week, because they did not get along. First and foremost, they did not get along whatsoever. And he wasn't going to follow the same mistakes that John Tyler did.
Didn't do anything for the better part
when he ascended to the presidency. And
from 1842 until he
his cabinet's really interesting.
Then he becomes the vice president.
Appoints a lot of the same people. Not
the point I'm trying to make.
A lot of the similar
life
people, for the most part, in terms of trying to bring party unity together.
Makes you really contemplate
Specifically, ironically, he brings in Daniel Webster as the Secretary of State. Same exact person who was the Secretary of State for
one day
William Henry Harrison and John Tyler in the very beginning.
You know, you're gonna be president.
I just think that's really interesting. He would actually die in office and be replaced by
Millard Fillmore,
this guy Edward Everett.
Both unique,
most notable politicians I would probably say
he just basically
that were part of his cabinet would be Thomas Corwin and John J. Crittenden.
And yet,
they would basically, I believe they would both be Republicans. Both of them would have an influence in the during the Civil War period. And Crittenden in particular, I think, has not the best view of Abraham Lincoln, but he's from Kentucky and really is very pro-union, so I think that's really interesting.
Basically 2 years.
The most notable personal friend of Millard Fillmore would be Nathaniel Hall as his postmaster general, his actual law firm partner. I might want to add, so I think that's really interesting. And then other notable people, I believe, would be Alexander
anyone can be president.
Hugh Holmes Stewart, who would be the actual Secretary of the Interior, and then William Alexander Graham, who would be the Secretary of the Navy. He'd actually be the vice presidential candidate for the failed presidential run. Sorry, I can't speak for the failed vice presidential run for Winfield Scott.
And I've said a lot about him.
And again, ironically, really another former general, etc.,
one of the few presidents, I think,
to run for president in a lot of. Again, that's going to be a really interesting election when I get to Franklin Pierce. Fillmore would also have,
I don't think for him, there's
technically speaking, 2 openings, but he would only fill one specific spot. Levi Woodbury would die in 1851, and through a whole slew of a whole bunch of different political processes I don't even want to get into, he settles on Benjamin Robbins Curtis. He has a difficult time really trying to find a proper Supreme Court justice, but he's basically like, well, Daniel Webster basically likes him, so I'll pick him for the most part. And a lot of people saw him as, well, they saw Benjamin Robert Curtis as this anti-slavery person, and a lot of the senators, mainly the Democrats, were very apprehensive about it. So it took a long time, unfortunately, for him to actually just trials and tribulations, debates, etc., but he's finally affirmed, confirmed in 1851. And then another Associate Justice, John McKinley, I think is his name. He dies in basically middle of 1852, and he basically nominates a shit ton of justices, a lot of them, I think 4 or 5 of them, and the Senate basically says, okay, we're not doing it this time. You already got one. You're not going to get a second one. An election was coming up, and there was a potential for, one of their justices to get the opportunity. Franklin Pierce is probably going to win the election. I think he's another dark horse candidate technically, because they didn't really think he was going to win. But, there's a possibility that, the Democrats are going to get the presidency again. So they do quite literally everything that he can, or that they do everything that they can do in order to stop Millard from appointing another seat to the presidency itself. So first and foremost, where is this country at when Millard Fillmore becomes president? I will put it to you this way. Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be coming out very soon, I believe, if it hasn't already come out. The Underground Railroad's going to be a thing around this particular point in time. This country is going to be very divided, and it's already very divided at this particular point, even before Millard Fillmore becomes president. This compromise of 1850 is this real big battle between what effectively is going to be the popular sovereignty of the states and, just the abolition of slavery. This issue is 100% within the forefront, and although there's been basically the last 2 or 3 presidents have tried to avoid it, Millard Fillmore is going to be the really in a lot of ways the first president that's really going to have to functionally deal with the issue itself. Northern interests and southern interests are basically occurring in a lot of ways, and I'll get to it when I talk about the Compromise of 1850 and a whole bunch of other things during Millard Fillmore's time as president. But for the most part, the North itself is rapidly industrializing to a point where, by the time the Civil War comes around, they're going to be Gucci. They're going to have all the weapons made. They're going to have, they have all the people, really, for the most part. And the South is really just going to keep holding strong in their ideas and their ideology, for better for them and for better, for worse for everyone else, unfortunately. And, the world itself is in a very interesting point, too. Like I said, there's immigration going on. The Irish potato famine's probably, I think, occurring around this particular point in time. All I know is that immigration from Ireland is just being expedited to such a large degree. Basically a lot of... it was such a big reason why he ended up losing a lot of... the gubernatorial race back in 44 was just because there's such a large immigrant population that was basically like, why are you not saying no to slavery? We don't like these authoritarians regardless of color, creed, etc., just say no slavery. He probably would have won had he just been staunchly anti-slavery, but he's not. He's trying to play both sides in a lot of ways. And this country is really kind of in just a real troubled time. There's going to be some economic problems that are coming along that's going to make things even more difficult, primarily with, Pierce and Buchanan's presidency, but a lot of the economic troubles are really starting here. A lot of it having to do with a whole bunch of the different tariffs, and ultimately as well, just the genuine reality that, technology is moving at a very, very, very fast pace, and, the South isn't catching up, and things are turning and trending towards northern interests. Industry, the Industrial Revolution, the second wave of it, is really going to start occurring around this particular point in time. Understand what is happening right now, and understand that from Millard Fillmore's presidency from 1850 to 1852, a lot of things are going to happen. What is the world like when Millard Fillmore is president? Well, during his presidency, a lot of things happen. A lot of novels and a lot of literary works are really written within basically the 3-year span that he becomes president. A lot of things happen. First and foremost, the ophthalmoscope. I'm a terrible pronunciation, but it's that thing that doctors use to examine your retina and the actual interior of the eye, the light thing. Just make sure you're all good. A lot of things are happening. First and foremost, in America, like wildfires are a thing still, and San Francisco actually experiences some of the most devastating wildfires early in 1850, around this particular point in time. Emanuel Lutz, he finishes Washington crossing the Delaware, Nathaniel Hawthorne publishes The Scarlet Letter, American Express is a thing. They actually started, I believe, as a business express delivery service before, actually becoming into banking in a lot of ways. The French are making moves. Napoleon III is going to be a thing, and he's going to establish basically this new republic in a lot of ways, or this new empire, whatever you want to call it. I can't wait to do a deep dive on him. He's going to be really interesting. And, they begin colonizing a whole bunch of different things. They colonize Algeria and really become a thing around this particular point in time. You understand, this is happening while Millard Fillmore is president. Just interesting little tidbits. And what else? German physicist Rudolf Clausius defines the second law of thermodynamics. The modern acoustic guitar is invented in Spain. The Taiping Rebellion is happening around this particular point in time. That's actually really fascinating. It's going to span several years throughout the entirety of Millard Fillmore's presidency. Charles Dickens publishes the personal history of David Copperfield. I think they actually came out with a movie this year starring that Dev Patel guy. Interesting. P.T. Barnum is a thing. He contracts the grand opera singer, the Swedish Nightingale, Jenny Lind, for the American tour. Cubans and Americans are trying to overthrow Spanish rule in Cuba, but they fail. That's actually a very interesting story. I don't want to get into it because I don't want this video to end up being way longer than it should be. Moby Dick by Herman Melville is published around this particular point in time. Astrology is the thing too. The moons of Uranus are founded, along with the first YMCA being opened up in Boston. There's another fire in Congress, I believe, around this particular... I don't know what is up with books just being burned, but the Library of Congress is again burned late, I think in 1850, along with a lot of Thomas Jefferson's personal books that he did. That's really tragic. Wells Fargo begins around this particular point in time. Their famous logos and whatnot. It's happening. It's happening now. Also, again, Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. The new Palace of Westminster opens up in Britain. Uncle Sam himself, the grand man, becomes a cartoon, or appears in cartoon form around this particular point in time during Millard Fillmore's presidency. So let's get right into it. The very first thing he's going to have to deal with is this Compromise of 1850. I briefly probably touched on it, but I'll try and explain it to the best of my ability here. Zachary Taylor started it, and it was going to really just occur and finish at the very beginning of Millard Fillmore's presidency. But ultimately, the Compromise of 1850 is 5 different things, ultimately. It's allowing California to become a free state, the creation of the territories of Utah, New Mexico, that could allow slavery. It abolishes the slave trade in Washington, D.C., pays about $10 million to Texas for its claims to adjoining territories, and the Fugitive Slave Act, ultimately with the last thing. Basically what they're trying to fight over is slavery and new territories. That's just the really simplified version of it. It's a little more complicated than that because they're trying to figure out borders. They're trying to create a whole bunch of new states. Arizona really isn't a thing yet at this particular point in time, because Texas is like, I want all this stuff, but they're gonna have to they're basically saying, look, Texas, you can't have all this stuff. We'll give you some money so you can do this, etc., etc. And Oklahoma becomes a thing, and New Mexico becomes a thing, Arizona becomes a thing, and Utah, Colorado, all of these places become states effectively. Because of the Compromise of 1850 in a lot of ways, and here's what they're trying to do. California is the first state that wants to gain statehood specifically, and Texas, or not Texas. Why do I keep saying Texas? The South basically just like, bruh, California totally wants to be a slave state, and North's like, no, it doesn't, and then California's like, no, we definitely don't. Well, basically, for the South, they're of the mindset, well, we're going to have to at least allow the opportunity for slavery to occur in a lot of these territories, and not to mention, too, I don't think they want California to be the beginning of this trend of a whole bunch of different states being free and whatnot, because they still want the institution of slavery to exist, and a whole bunch of different fights are going to occur around this particular point in time. Damn you, California, But ultimately, Henry Clay comes up with a compromise. He's basically like, okay, I'm going to do this thing, yada, yada. And a whole bunch of different people really contribute to this. But Henry Clay is the one that's leading the charge and, writing a whole bunch of the specific details that go along with it. And basically, unfortunately, one of the big details that's going to help calm Southern nerves is this Fugitive Slave Act. That's the big one. If this is going to work, Fillmore needs to sign it and, put it into law for the most part. And, they all agree and vote it in. So all Millard Fillmore has to do is just sign it. Congress had approved all 5 of these measures, which was really big for the South. I gotta give it to them to give up a lot. So basically, slavery is just going to be literally in those southern states, like the whole, what would effectively become the Deep South later on when we get into the 90s. I just think that's really interesting. Millard Fillmore is in a bit of a pickle, in a bit of a dilemma. He gets in and he's like, oh shit, this is going to happen, this is going to occur. And there's a whole bunch of different interpretations of what ends up happening. He writes to Daniel Webster. He talks to John Crittenden, and they're basically just like, you got to do this if you want to keep slavery from actually happening and spreading. So Millard Fillmore, just with his own personal wisdom, decides, I'll just do it. He signs in the Compromise of 1850 and specifically signs in the Fugitive Slave Act. So you're probably asking, what is the Fugitive Slave Act? It is specifically anyone who aids a fugitive or slave within the North and does not actually help bring that slave back to their actual rightful Southern owner is going to be held liable and will be jailed for about 6 months, $1,000 fine, etc., etc. It's basically any slave that's going to actually basically be free. They're not actually free when they actually escape to the North, which a lot of these slaves are basically doing that. You know, the whole Underground Railroad is a thing at this particular point in time, and this would actually force a lot of slaves to go all the way to Canada in order to actually have their freedom, which is really difficult. And there's a whole bunch of different interpretations that you come across when you read about Millard Fillmore, because the pro people who are basically like, this was a necessary evil that Millard Fillmore had to do in order to basically stop slavery, which you can argue because there's really not going to be a lot of slave states that are going to occur at this particular point in time, and slavery is really held within the Deep South itself. Not to mention, too, a lot of people have just basically said this basically postponed the Civil War for 10 years, and the North can actually have the ability to win the war, etc., etc. And personally, this is just a terrible move by Millard Fillmore. It's people like Millard Fillmore that make it very difficult for me because, say what you will about, I don't like unprincipled people. I think it's just my personal view. You can be like, it's like even today, for instance, you could be the most horrible right-winger or the most horrible, commie socialist, whatever you want. But if you believe in it and you're not going to change your perspective or your opinion, more power to you. Whatever, And Millard Fillmore is basically saying, I hate slavery, but this is a necessary evil, etc., etc. And I hear that, and I'm trying to hear the pro-arguments, but, your best pro-arguments are this is going to postpone the slavery for 10 years. Like, sure, I guess, maybe. I don't think it really postpones it all that much. I don't think Civil War is going to occur, especially when you read about the Civil War and you read the events that lead up to the Civil War. This compromise isn't the actual thing that begins it by any stretch of the imagination. Bleeding Kansas is probably the one, and just John Brown is really someone that scares the living shit out of people, that it really... I'm going on a rant here, but effectively your best arguments for trying to justify this to positively look positively for Millard Fillmore, I personally believe are just pointless. They're not good, and at the very best, you can't do wishful thinking in terms of what ifs, and Millard Fillmore, I think, made the absolute wrong choice when he signed this specific compromise in. But again, that's just me personally. Ultimately, the downfall would be a lot of these things, though, in fairness. Basically, this compromise of 1850 is going to lead, in a lot of ways, to Bleeding Kansas and a whole bunch of the other problems that are going to be the rising tensions that would lead to civil war. So after the compromise of 1850, the country's in a bit of a weird mood, a weird mindset, I think. Ultimately, things start happening. People are basically just trying to react to what is happening. And the initial beginnings of what would be the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act really caused a lot of problems, a lot of tension. Northern law enforcement attempt to actually enforce the law, a lot of fugitive slaves, and they're often met with mobs, people getting really violent trying to defend the slave itself, and it became a real problem in the North. Who would have figured people don't like slavery in the North, little things like that. Anyways, the Fugitive Slave Act, all that stuff, really only did heighten tensions between the North and the South. In fairness to my previous comments, it did heighten it, but not to a point where something like Bleeding Kansas would occur. It was basically just, people were kind of picking sides, but no real specific aggressive, pure death of violence had really occurred quite yet. But people were picking sides, and a lot of people were having a whole bunch of talks, I guess you could say. This union was really changing, and specifically in the South, because there's a bunch of people that were holding elections in the South. Basically, I guess you could say they're basically separated by what they're unionists or what would be known as fire eaters, specifically. This was basically just a weird creation in a lot of ways of like another party system. They weren't Whigs or Democrats. They were basically, are we for the union or are we for something else entirely itself? And a lot of people were basically just going back and forth within the South itself. And it's also during this particular point in time that a lot of these issues are really occurring, for the most part, within Millard Fillmore's presidency. So under the influence of Daniel Webster and Winfield Scott himself, General Winfield Scott, he's basically attempts to enforce a bunch of forts in the South, notably Charleston in particular, and really just trying to supplement with a whole bunch of military support, just in case anything goes wrong. Preserve, protect, always the Union, and specifically federal government's buildings, etc., in the South. And aside from that, Millard Fillmore attempts to do just his own presidential shit for the most part. First and foremost, immediately after the Compromise of 1850 is finally ratified and passed, Millard Fillmore appoints Latter-day Saints leader, Church of Jesus Christ, Birmingham Young, as the first governor of the Utah Territory. I think he actually names the initial capital Fillmore, and the other surrounding county Millard. I think it's really fascinating and interesting. And there's a whole bunch of other things happening too. Oregon is going to get gold. The California gold rush is going fucking crazy at this particular point in time. 1850. The people are just losing their minds there. And Millard Fillmore is also trying to push through a whole bunch of different infrastructure projects in the early goings of 1850 to 1851. Investments in roads, railways, waterways. He's really trying to push for a transcontinental railroad, and basically a long time proponent of Henry Clay's American system in a lot of ways. And it's really, really difficult. It wouldn't really be passed until about a decade later, unfortunately. But they're also he's also trying to change the tariff as well. A high tariff and basically federally sponsored banks and infrastructures. And Congress is not trying to change anything itself. Congress, at this particular point in time, is a Democrat majority in both houses, or at least not a majority. I know it's a Democrat majority in the Senate. I think it might be a plurality in the House itself. But anyways, Democrats are ruling Congress, and they're just biding their time until they get their next presidential candidate up. But for most of Millard Fillmore's time in office specifically, this is going to be really just purely him just trying to beat the drum for infrastructure and being shot down in a lot of ways, just like John Tyler was himself when he was president. In fairness, though, a lot of things that aren't occurring within the country itself, Millard Fillmore actually has a pretty strong influence overseas in a lot of ways, and he's really focusing a lot of his efforts on that as well. A lot of things are happening. First and foremost, he has two very solid secretaries of state, Daniel Webster, and then when Daniel Webster dies, Edward Everett. He's actually a pretty solid Secretary of State and a really fascinating individual too when you actually really look into him. And he's going to help oversee a lot of the foreign policy that Millard Fillmore is going to try and implement, which, in fairness, is really his. in a lot of ways. He's trying to expand trade and really pushing specifically towards the Pacific, notably with the territory of Hawaii, dealing with King Kamehameha, the third, and really dealing with the issues of trying to annex Hawaii, because a lot of people are basically kind of going back and forth, like, we should have Hawaii be a state, but then I'm gonna guess probably specifically like the southern states, unfortunately, are probably like, no, we don't want the non-white people to be part of the union yet, at the very least. But obviously the most important thing that specifically Millard Fillmore is known for is sending Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan. He's trying to open up trade in the Far East, and specifically in countries that have not really had any people there: Siam, Japan, etc., etc. China is a completely different monster, and it's a very complicated issue with China, especially with the whole Taiping Rebellion and a whole bunch of different things that are going to occur, notably the Yellow Turban Rebellion, or not the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and then another rebellion is going to occur. I'm mixing Chinese history up a little bit. Not the Yellow Turban Rebellion. That's like fucking 600 years even before this particular point in time. But he's trying to open up trade with Japan. Unfortunately, he wouldn't be able to really see it through, as by the time Commodore Perry comes back, Franklin Pierce is president. The other notable thing too would be other issues with other countries, trying to recognize Hungarian independence, especially with Germany kind of becoming a weird place, I guess you could say. Understand, Germany is in a very, 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 very strange place in time. Karl Marx is the thing. He actually is going to post a whole bunch of his work, I guess you could say, in the New York Tribune during his presidency. Otto von Bismarck is a thing, and everything's happening, like German unification's happening, and Europe's in a very weird funk and state of mind, and he's just trying to play cool ultimately with Europe until Napoleon III is trying to take and annex Hawaii, and he's like, no man, you better back the fuck off. The other notable thing would be the issue with Cuba and basically trying to overthrow Spanish rule there, and numerous attempts there, but that's actually a very long and specific story. But ultimately it fails, and as I noted earlier. Just to briefly sum it up, and it's unfortunate for Millard Fillmore, though, the 2.5+ years that he's effectively president, almost 3 years, he really is unable to get a lot of things done, anything that he really wants to do. His main focus is infrastructure work, and foreign policy-wise, just trying to open up Japan, obviously. But most of his presidency, too, is just trying to deal with Congress that basically just has an overall Democratic majority, and trying to deal with, effectively, I guess you could say, downfall and the aftermath of the Compromise of 1850 and the implementation of the Fugitive Slave Act. And it's unfortunate. He spends 3 years fighting it. It's really difficult on the family. Even Buffalo's kind of like, bro, get the fuck out of here, man. Like, what are you doing, homie? And it's just really difficult. His reputation suffers. His perfectly coiffed reputation. He's trying to bring himself up to be this type of individual, person, etc., etc. And it's just tough. It's difficult. And the good looks of Millard Fillmore start taking way to really, really, really fucking white hair. And it looks like he's aged about 10 years and 2.5. It's not looking good for Millard Fillmore. And it's unfortunate, too, because, he's contemplating maybe should I even attempt to run for re-election. And it's really difficult. And it's really complicated to explain how people felt about Millard Fillmore. He was not a very well-liked person at all, but he wasn't abandoned in the same way that John Tyler was during his specific presidency. There was a real, genuine opportunity for Millard Fillmore to actually be renominated and, potentially win the presidency in his own right. Now, things were very complicated. Things were very difficult on the actually very close-knit, tight family, and, it was very just difficult. It's one thing to be a hated person, but hated on both sides, North and South. It's a very complicated person. The Fugitive Slave Act did not make him a friend to any Northerner. Not to mention, the South just didn't like him. So it was very difficult for him to win. That being said, the Whigs were pretty fucking weak. They were gonna. Daniel Webster was not Daniel Webster. Millard Fillmore was prepared to let Daniel Webster have a real shot at the presidency, but he died at quite an old age. I think around 70s. He was getting up there. But he was like, I can't do this anymore. Do you want to do it? Daniel Webster's like, why not? And dies. And the Whigs really didn't have an option for quite a long time. And then General Winfield Scott comes in and basically says, fuck it, I'll try it. And basically it's just a battle between the two, Millard Fillmore and General Winfield Scott. And it's interesting. There's a whole bunch of different politics that go along with it. William Seward, again, the New York governor, just poking his head in. He basically just backs General Winfield Scott. And to a lot of people, that actually seemed like a real big negative for Winfield Scott, because I officially just made him just a pure Northern candidate. Because I think Winfield Scott was anti-compromise of 1850 or something like that, and at the very least, there was some viability that Millard Fillmore, being a proponent of the compromise of 1850, might have some leeway with some of the Southerners. But ultimately, the Whigs ended up going with General Winfield Scott as the next presidential nominee for the election of 1852. Now, don't get me wrong, Millard Fillmore was obviously pretty bummed out for the most part, but at the same time, this is also going to be kind of a good point. He's both melancholy and upbeat. A lot of things are happening near the tail end of Millard Fillmore's presidency. His wife's actually, I've never really brought up his wife for the most part, but she does the normal functions. She actually establishes the first real library within the White House itself, I might want to add, and I think that's really valiant of her. And things are things are just much more peaceful for the family once it's very clear Millard Fillmore is going to be leaving office. They're chilling. They're enjoying the library, the blue room, or the Oval Office, and the blue room. And they start spending a lot more time with each other. Millard Fillmore listens to his daughter play the piano, harp, the new guitar. And really just enjoying himself, enjoying the last couple months that he has as a president itself. That being said, things are only going to get much, much, much worse for Millard Fillmore in a lot of other ways. His daughter Abby actually ends up filling in for Mrs. Fillmore, Abigail, during some White House functions. She actually breaks her ankle, I believe, and I'm going to guess it gets infected, not to mention, too, old age is really creeping up on her. Things are going to get, only unfortunately for Millard Fillmore, are going to get worse from there on. So Millard Fillmore leaves the White House on March 4th, 1853, and they basically go through the whole parade, yada yada, and enjoying his farewell address and farewell parade. And his wife's just not doing too good. Her ankle's still broken. She gets sick, and they try to nurse her cold once they get back home to Buffalo, or not to Buffalo, to the hotel first, specifically before they go back to Buffalo. And unfortunately, because of the cold, she ends up developing pneumonia. And pneumonia, around that particular point in time, it's very dangerous. It's very deadly. There's not a lot of antibiotics back then to actually help assist and alleviate the symptoms of pneumonia. The wet lung, as some people in the medical community will call it. Anyways, 3 weeks. Abigail just slowly deteriorates. She dies on March 30th. The family then goes back to Buffalo, one less than when they had originally left Buffalo. So I didn't want to make that really sound pretty horribly, but Abigail dies, and it's just a really difficult and contentious retirement to start off with Millard for Millard Fillmore. Unfortunately, it's a tough time Very, very tough time for Millard Fillmore. And, people go into particular mindsets and they kind of just think, man, you know what? I'm going to go to my safe space, my good place. And Millard Fillmore, unfortunately for him, his good place and his safe place is politics. He starts talking about a whole bunch of different things. He's actually even talking about the whole idea of, a presidential retirement plan, etc. He didn't need money. Money is not an actual problem, but he's basically just like, it's a fucking disgrace that the president could, be poor as shit when he leaves office, and, it wouldn't be implemented, I think, until Harry Truman, but I'm not sure. It's one of those presidents, not FDR. It's a president after FDR specifically that does that, which I think is ironic. But Millard Fillmore decides he's just going to follow politics. He's going to try and go through grieving in that particular way. It's not obviously like he's going to, I'm going to grieve this way. He just does it to stop thinking about the death of his wife. So, 1854, he decides he's going to make his actual contribution to the country in a lot of ways and really push forward and really get a gauge of where everyone is at and travel the country, judge its pulse, and attempt to ensure communication remains open, because at this particular point in time, which I will get to specifically when I talk about Franklin Pierce, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to occur. There's a whole bunch of things that are going to be happening and a whole bunch of other people and other issues that are going to occur. They're going to expedite what effectively will be civil war. He talks to all these political leaders, all these, just the normal man itself, and comes to the conclusion that the idea of political parties representing national interest, it's not actually happening in the way that it is. That political parties are evil, and that political parties are just doing things not actually for the common man, They're basically just going with whatever the party wants to. And he's just like, interesting. And it's becoming a bit of a problem for Millard Fillmore to kind of really realize this particular realization. I understand Millard Fillmore and a whole bunch of these, newer generation politicians that didn't specifically grow up with, the Washingtons, etc. And that's why I think it's really fascinating and interesting with a lot of these newer politicians, from John Tyler on, for instance. A lot of these guys, they're not born during the revolution. A lot of these guys are born after the revolution, and all they've grown up with in a lot of ways is just political parties and the interests of the party over the actual idea of America, and I think that's really interesting. And he comes to this conclusion himself that political parties aren't really good, we should probably not do that shit anymore. And he's going to be an individual that's going to help represent another particular political party in the future. But first, before any of that happens, his daughter dies. I know that came out of nowhere, but his daughter had actually been sick for quite some time. She had cholera. I think she was 23 years old at this particular point in time. But he gets word and comes home and basically mourns her. And it's really difficult within a 2-year span to lose your wife and then your daughter. Very, very difficult. Very functionally traumatic for Millard Fillmore. Deciding that he just didn't want enough more tragedy in his life, Millard Fillmore decides, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to enjoy my life. I'm going to try and enjoy all the things that I can enjoy before my time goes, because life is very fleeting, etc., etc. Very depressing time for Millard Fillmore. So he decides he's gonna go and do the thing that he always wanted to do. He's gonna go to Europe. He's gonna travel Europe. He's gonna enjoy life for whatever he can. He goes fucking everywhere in Europe, And he goes to a whole bunch of different places. He goes to the fucking Vatican, visits the Pope. He actually meets with another former president, Martin Van Buren, that's over there while he's in London. He also gets to meet and is acquainted with Queen Victoria, one of the most prominent and probably one of the most influential figures just in world history. And then, he goes and to Paris, and he's like, "Hey, Napoleon III, are we Gucci?" Etc., etc. I don't think he actually meets him, but he's enjoying life for what it is. Before he comes back home, around 1855, 1856. So when he comes home, he actually received word earlier, by the way, about this new political party that was rising, calling themselves the Know-Nothings. He was asked to be their president, and when he comes home, he's like, "All right, guys, I'm back. I'm your president." So he becomes the actual presidential nominee in the election of 1856, which I'll get to when I talk about James Buchanan. But ultimately, he becomes kind of like the de facto leader of this weird coalition group of people. A lot of Whigs were leaving the party. The party was dissolving, and they were kind of creating this weird new Know-Nothing party, and then the Republican Party. The Know-Nothing specifically were really strange. They were very pro-nativist, very anti-Catholic. They wanted to restrict, Irish immigration, a whole bunch of immigration. It was kind of like a bit, religiously biased and kind of racist in a lot of ways. Depends on how you look at it. But for the most part, it was just about, strengthening America and strengthening the bonds that, make us American, etc., etc. So anyways, he ends up basically just being a part of the Know-Nothing party and says, "I'll be your president. I don't advocate for any of the shit that you're espousing. I don't want to be a part of this anti-immigrant message. But ultimately, I'll just, fuck it. Why not? Throw my hat in the ring, because who knows what's going to happen, because at this particular point in time, the Whigs really aren't doing anything, and Republicans are kind of not strong enough, and the Democrats, after Franklin Pierce's just immensely disastrous presidency, there's a real possibility that a third party might actually win, or this random party might actually win." Long story short, he does not win. He only wins about 21% of the votes. And actually, in a lot of ways, actually probably stops the first Republican president from happening. John C. Fremont is trying to run, but ultimately a lot of the states that would be northern states, I think he loses Maryland because Millard Fillmore ends up taking it. So you could probably in a lot of ways thank Millard Fillmore for the election and presidency of James Buchanan. So after this election, Millard Fillmore decides he's going to officially 100% retire. He's getting old, life's just kind of depressing, to be quite honest with you, and he struggled for some point in time in Europe, trying to get over the loss of his wife and daughter and things, and it helped a little bit, meeting Queen Victoria and other individuals and people. Martin Van Buren actually helped a lot, I think, but for the most part, it's been really difficult for Martin Van Buren to deal with the loss. And when he returns back to Buffalo, officially to retire, he decides he's going to try and overcome it, which I think is a triumph of the spirit for Martin Van Buren. Oh, not Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore. God, I'm getting these two people mixed up. I'm getting a whole bunch of different people mixed up. I apologize. Millard Fillmore decides he's going to be much more open and really meet other people and not be this weird, depressed recluse, optimistic person. It's really fascinating. He just looks at things on the bright side. And, meets a lot of other people, starts holding a whole bunch of different social gatherings, becomes the person that he's supposed to be and that he was before. And in this, he actually meets a really brilliant lady named Carolyn McIntosh. She was a wealthy Albany widow, and the two actually get married very quickly, I might add, very early on in 1858, and they immediately become this power couple. He's reinvigorated in every single meaningful way. They buy a mansion in Niagara Square, and basically their home becomes the home. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't even know how to quite explain it. It's kind of just like you go into like the Buffalo area, you're just in New York. It's like, dude, we gotta go to the Millard Fillmore place. You know what I'm saying? It becomes the actual place. It becomes. I mean, first off, any presidential home is a presidential home, but for them, it's also like the big minds are coming along. Everyone goes there. It's the prime location for social gatherings to occur. Abraham Lincoln would be there en route to D.C. In 1861. I might want to add during this period of time. It was one of the people who would actually be there itself that Millard Fillmore would host himself. Once Civil War begins, though, things become very tricky. Millard Fillmore, prior to Civil War starting, I want to add and just want to point this in, really devotes his life to a whole bunch of different charitable causes, different charities, and really devotes his life from that point on to organizing and trying to help Union Continentals, I guess you could say, protect northern states and northern estates for the most part. Sorry, I don't know how I'm wording that properly. Basically, he puts a lot of effort within the actual Civil War effort itself. He was always worried about Buffalo, and specifically, the potential for the British to come and invade from, Canada and whatnot, and he was always worried about British intervention and just the borders between the United States and Canada. But for the most part, he's basically just helping the war effort, trying to get Buffalo citizens and other New York State citizens to enlist and join a whole bunch of different regiments for the war effort itself to defeat slavery, etc., etc. Millard Fillmore is really back and forth, honestly, during this period in time. Because on one hand, he's a 100% Unionist, and he's all in for the Union, and really respects Abraham Lincoln, and is just following his example of, effectively, if the South wants to give up, we got to extend our hand and welcome them back in, etc., etc. But he kind of goes a bit too far in a lot of ways. He's always been a bit of a sympathizer, I think, in a lot of ways, and I think midway through, around 1863, his attitudes really changed in a lot of aspects towards the direction the country was going in. He enjoyed Lincoln, and he thought he was a good man. I just didn't think he thought Lincoln was going to be best for the future of the country. So he ended up putting a lot of his faith and voting for specifically George B. McClellan, the Democrat, and actually Lincoln's former general before Grant and all these other people, for the election of 1864. And this is going to be very tumultuous, especially in New York, when Lincoln is going to win such a big landslide victory eventually. But for the most part, he's kind of seen as like a weird, fascinating. He's not a pariah by any stretch of the imagination, but it's very, very difficult for him to kind of come back from that specifically. In New York, it's very strongly Union and very anti-slavery in every stretch of the imagination. And then when Lincoln dies, he doesn't paint or drape his door with black, in commemorance for Lincoln's death. He was out of town, so he couldn't really do it, but still, a lot of people saw this as a bit of a slight, and it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So his reputation in Buffalo wouldn't be, unfortunately, the same as it would have been before. But for the most part, that's basically just his entire time and his entire effort within the war itself. Fillmore was basically, despite the negative antagonism or the negative thoughts against Lincoln, he was the one of the very few people in Lincoln's, I guess you could say, funeral cortege arrived. He's one of the main people leading the delegation, gives the speeches, etc., and prays for Lincoln. And anyways, like I said before, he just continues doing his whole charitable organizations, doing a whole bunch of different things. becoming the first chancellor of the University of Buffalo. He founded the Buffalo General Hospital, I might want to add. In Buffalo, you gotta thank Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore was the guy who gave you everything. He's trying to improve the city in every way that he could, and helped start the Buffalo Arts Academy, Buffalo Historical Society, Buffalo's chapter of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. He's just basically fucking Gucci in every way for y'all. You know what I'm saying? And he does this for the next decade of his life, devoting his life to improving Buffalo in any meaningful way that he possibly could. In February 13th of 1874, Millard Fillmore suffers a stroke on his left side. He kind of recovered a little bit, but then he got another stroke and fell, and he's just like, It's really, sorry. I'm making light of a pretty horrible, unfortunate future death for Millard Fillmore. But ultimately, the stroke just left him functionally paralyzed, to a point where he literally could not speak or swallow anything. By March 8th, Millard Fillmore, March 8th, 1874, would die. The last Whig president. How do I even describe Millard Fillmore? How do I even attempt to really explain his life, his legacy, and try to come up with something that's feasible? Because I try to understand Millard Fillmore, and I spend so much time just trying to read him. I probably read his just American President book alone at least 2 or 3 times, and I can't get a good gauge of him, I think, is ultimately what it really comes down to. He's both simple and complicated, because he's simple in the sense that, like, he's just very pro-union to a point where he's going to fucking just like, I'm gonna fucking haul this slave back down to the South if necessary. But at the same time, he's going to vote for McClellan. But then again, if McClellan's the guy that's going to be this appeasement kind of person, he's always just going to do it. And I think that's just ultimately who Millard Fillmore ultimately was just an appeasement kind of individual person, no matter the context, really. And I don't like that. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why I'm struggling to come up with some semblance of, respect in a lot of ways for Millard Fillmore. It's not like I don't respect him, but, say what you will about the other previous presidents, but a large majority of them probably would not have gone the way that Millard Fillmore did, which I think is the big reason why a lot of people have conflicting feelings about Millard Fillmore. Because at the very least, your best case is he's just doing something different. But then at the very same end of the spectrum, he's just appeasing Southern interests at the cost of basically a lot of slaves, a lot of black people, and specifically even just Northern interests in a lot of ways. And he's just trying to play both sides, and ultimately that's just not very conducive. You can try and be in the middle. You can try to be in the middle, and I will give you some admiration, but you gotta be principled on some things, and some things you just gotta put your foot down and deal with. And Millard Fillmore was one that I struggled to try and find something that he was specifically steadfast in, that was going to be some form fundamentally of a principled idea that he was going to push forward, or some idea that he was going to really try to implement in a meaningful way. You could say some of his infrastructure ideas, or a lot of the taxing, etc., the imprisonment and stuff like that. Obviously those are some things, but Millard Fillmore just wasn't one that was, like little things. He's got a whole bunch of different things that you can point to specifically, but the big stuff, I don't even know if he functionally was against Texas specifically or for Texas specifically. I think he was against Texas, but he wasn't going to say, hey, Texas can't have slaves in that particular territory, though, if we do get it. So it's really complicated ultimately with Millard Fillmore. Fillmore specifically really makes me question what the fuck does the president actually do, because I tend to think, I think presidents should be objective as much as possible. And when you think of Millard Fillmore as objective, that's it's like the thing that comes to mind when you think of a president. And then I come to the realization that, presidents in general really normally and genuinely speaking are not as objective as I tend to think sometimes. They take stances. There's lines that once you attempt to cross them, they're like specific principled things that presidents just do. I look at George Washington, for instance, and I think, man, he's pretty objective as humanly possible. But it's like, okay, but if you're not going to pay a tax, I'm going to lead a fucking army down there, and we're going to fucking throw hands, homie. And I just, Millard Fillmore is just not like that. He's just trying to be as unbiased and objective as possible and do what's best for what he thinks is for the country. And that's just not how it should be. If I'm going to be 100% honest with you, like, oh, you can't play both sides. I'm like, this country is not functionally built on the president being objective. It's basically partisan ideas, on principled ideas, I guess you could say, and Congress battles it out for the most part, and the president in a lot of ways just ends up having to choose, the specific idea that is going to work both for the future advancement of the country in a subjective way and also in the objective interpretation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and specifically, enforcing the actual constitutional law onto the country itself. That's what the president should be doing. And I gotta be 100% honest here, I just don't think Millard Fillmore actually specifically did it in that particular way, shape, and form. And I don't think he accomplished any of those specific things that, when I think of a president that, should be doing what they should be doing, he just didn't do it. And you can have an obvious disagreement with me about that, and you can come up with your own interpretation of it. That's just how I personally see it. And again, this isn't because Millard Fillmore is a bad person. This just makes me think Millard Fillmore is one that should never have gotten the opportunity to really become president. And it's sad, and it sucks, And again, I might have some biases, obviously, so take it with a grain of salt, But every time I think of Millard Fillmore now, I just think of, he really is that kid that, grew up the poor son of a farmer, So if I can add one final note about Millard Fillmore, I would probably just really ask you to, look into it yourself. You can listen to this, or you can listen to a whole bunch of other things, or, just pick up a book and read Millard Fillmore's history, his biographies, and just really try to understand, who he is and what kind of man he is. Because, Millard Fillmore is one of the few presidents that makes me just think what constitutes a president, what constitutes, good, evil, yada yada, He's morally ambiguous in a lot of ways, and I think he's a good man. I think he's just someone that basically, in a lot of ways, doesn't have a lot of spine, and like, say what you will about, him, the comparison to Abraham Lincoln, how they're very similar in a lot of ways, but Lincoln has some balls. Lincoln has some spine. Say what you will about, because Abraham Lincoln's not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. A lot of things that he would end up doing during his presidency, I'm not very happy about. I'm not very happy for. But there are very, very few people in this country who could have held the Union together in a way that Abraham Lincoln did. And Millard Fillmore is not one of those people that can do that. It's literally, if I could just count how many people and how many of the presidents have actually done it, I could probably say maybe 5 or 6 that probably would have handled it. Maybe. And I can't speculate because you don't know, Washington probably. Maybe FDR. But, FDR, that's more of an international thing for FDR, and I don't know about domestic stuff. And it's complicated with FDR. Maybe Teddy. But that's Teddy, because he's Teddy. And probably another 20th century president. I just can't think of any on the top of my head. But for the most part, Millard Fillmore is just not one of those people that does it. And it's not, and again, he's not a terrible person. But he's one that makes you really think, what is good, what is bad, and I really need to come to my own conclusion about all of this, because I was pretty indifferent, I think, when, I learned about Millard Fillmore. And, everyone knows Millard Fillmore. If they do not, okay, they don't know him specifically, but if they know anything about Millard Fillmore, it's always the Fugitive Slave Act, and that was a necessary evil in order to prevent slavery from happening, and Commodore Perry. But it goes a little more deeper than that. The reasons why. It's complicated, ultimately, really. I plan to do an episode specifically just on, the Compromise of 1850, a lot of the backstory that goes along with it eventually, and I hope to get to that pretty soon once I finish up all this shit with the presidents. But, if I could leave you with one final thought on Millard Fillmore again, specifically, I would probably just say this. Millard Fillmore really didn't do anything for the better part of 6 years. From 1842 until he becomes the vice president, and then he becomes the vice president and then becomes the president. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that Millard Fillmore's life makes things really interesting. It makes you really contemplate how life really works, how life is really interesting, and how life can just happen randomly. One day you're just vibing, chilling. Next thing you know, you're gonna be president within 2 years. Things happen, and Millard Fillmore's life full of both unique brilliance, I will admit, where he just basically literally comes from nothing. He's one of the poorest presidents in our entire country's history, and yet he becomes one of the more financially capable, successful, and ultimately ends up really becoming just a kick-ass kind of New York politician for quite some time, and ultimately ends up becoming, like I said before, the fucking president. But then he also has his wife and daughter die within basically 2 years of each other, and he's lived a fascinating life. Point fundamentally being that I'm trying to get at with this long-winded sentence that I've just been trying to explain for the most part. What I'm trying to say is that Millard Fillmore shows me this: anyone can be president. Rich, poor. Things can happen, and fortune might be in your favor. I think it just takes a lot of hard work. I think it takes a lot of just general determination, and a little luck. And ultimately, for Millard Fillmore, say what you will about him, and I've said a lot about him, it really is, in a lot of ways, one of the few presidencies, and one of the few presidents, I think, at least just in my personal opinion, that's lived a very fulfilling life. And I don't think for him there's been any regret for that. Thank you guys for listening, and hope you guys enjoy and listen to the next episode.